Good morning. My name is Stephanie Mayberry, and I serve as the Director of Student Success, and I am the co-chair of this conference. Welcome to day 3 of the Path Forward Forum. We started this virtual opportunity learning about the post-pandemic learner as Matt Gandel and the Pritchard Committee shared national and state data about our students. We had the great fortune of hearing from our post-secondary students as well. Yesterday, we were able to participate in breakout sessions that align with the things that we learned from the Pritchard Committee survey. The goals of those sessions were to equip us all with the toolkits necessary to return to our campus and districts to make a difference for our students. Today, we're going to learn about the post-pandemic transition as we prepare to venture on the path forward. With that being said, please allow me to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Verschelden, who recently retired as the Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs at Malcolm X College, City Colleges of Chicago, is a special projects advisor for the integration of academic and student affairs at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Dr. Verschelden taught more than 25 years at 2- and 4-year institutions in social work, sociology, women's studies, nonviolent studies, and first-year seminar. Her administrative posts have included department chair, institutional assessment lead, and vice president of academic and student affairs. She is the author of Bandwidth Recovery, helping students reclaim cognitive resources lost to poverty, racism, and social marginalization, as well as Bandwidth Recovery for Schools, helping pre-K through 12 students regain cognitive resources lost to poverty, trauma, racism, and social marginalization. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Verschelden. Please note that you can leave your comments in the chat, and if you have questions for Dr. Verschelden, enter them into the Q&A and she will answer them at the conclusion of her address. Welcome, Dr. Verschelden. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everybody. It's really morning here, only 8 o'clock. I'm in Kansas. And I'm speaking to you from Manhattan, Kansas, which is where Kansas State University is, where I taught for many, many years. And I've just moved back here from Chicago. So I want to say that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Kaw, Pawnee, and Osage indigenous peoples nations. And I'm going to borrow from K-State's statement, because Kansas State is a major presence here in Manhattan, Kansas. K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Dr. Thompson for his aspirational remarks on Wednesday, helping us to imagine a different future and challenging us that we don't have to do things the way we used to do them, which I hope we'll be able to make that transition. Thanks to Stephanie and Missy very much for your kind support leading up to this day, planning and making this happen. And thanks to each of you for the work you do every day to see that all students have the opportunity to learn and thrive in Kentucky. I'm going to share my slides here. I want to make a few remarks before I really start into the slides. And the first thing I want to say is the things I'm talking about today related to bandwidth are big societal phenomenon. So I will assert, and since we're not together and have a limited time, there's not time for you to talk me out of this view, but I will assert from most of my life in living in this country and teaching in social work and sociology, women's studies, et cetera, that this country from the very beginning is a racist country, a classist country. We're based on slavery for hundreds of years and the almost wiping out of it all the indigenous people on the land. We have, well, and we can go on, many of you know the history of the United States. So we have a racist, classist, sexist, homophobic in many areas, xenophobic, which means fear of people unlike ourselves, So we have a country that has that history. And I would also assert that those of us who grew up in this country have soaked up some of that toxic soup. And I would say that's true of all of us in all of our identities. So if we were together and I went around to each of you and said, are you a racist? Are you a classist? Are you a sexist? Of course, we would all say no to those things because we're educated, intelligent people. And we know, for instance, that race is a social construct. There's no difference between us based on our biology, the color of our skin, the shape of our eyes, the texture of our hair. Race is a made-up thing. Racism, however, is very real. But race is a social construct. So we know in our heads that everyone is equal, everybody should have equal access. But because we've grown up in this toxic soup, racist, sexist, homophobic things come out in our behavior. So, but the things that take away students' bandwidth and our bandwidth are these big picture things and have to do with our society. Second thing I want to talk about briefly is multitasking. And I hope you all know by now that multitasking is not a thing. That our brains don't multitask. So when we're in meetings, and I don't know about you all, but since the pandemic, I feel like I'm always multitasking. So if you have kids running around or you're trying to deal with home stuff and work, and it always feels like I'm trying to do more than one thing at once, but my brain can only do one thing. So for instance, I've been in lots of meetings where people are there, somebody's speaking, and most of the people have their laptops open and they're really doing their email or they're texting. And so once in a while I will text during a meeting. And what I think I'm doing in my head is, oh, I'll quickly send this text, but I'm really listening to what she's saying. Well, no, I'm not. My brain shifts over to the texting task, and then I flip back over to listening to the person talk. But actually, my brain can't do that. Immediately, there's a loss of attention on both sides of that. And I'm not saying that to tell you all to put your phone in your phones away so you can listen, although you could do that. I'm saying it because this is true of our students, from babies on through K-12 and to college and to us. So when our students come to the learning environment and they're worried, they're hungry, or they're worried about money, or they're worried that they don't belong, or they're not going to be respected or accepted, that part of their brain that's worried about those things is not available for learning because our brains can't multitask. So that's what this talk is going to be about, is how to get more of our students' brains available for learning. Okay, that's the end of the sermon. Now I'll go on to the talk. Okay, so several years ago, I read a book called Scarcity. And by the way, you have a set of handouts, I think, that are available, right, Bissy? So are they you sent them out? We should have clarified this before.
They're on the website where people visited to join your session today.
Well, thank you so much. Mm-hmm. So you have a list of resources. So when I mention an author or a book, you have them there. So I read a book called Scarcity that is by a professor at Princeton and one who was at Harvard at the time. And that's where I got the term bandwidth. So these two authors say that scarcity steals cognitive resources. And so they were taught, their whole book is about scarcity of economically, so persistent economic insecurity. And they talk about the bandwidth tax of poverty, basically, or economic insecurity. So they say in this country, we mostly blame people for being poor. So we say people are poor because they make bad choices. And these authors say, yes, people who are poor sometimes do make bad choices, especially in environments that encourage bad choices. But it's because their bandwidth is depleted, that they don't have, they can't think as well because they don't have as much of their cognitive capacity available. And let me back up, I should have said this before. So let me describe bandwidth just a bit more. So as we are sitting here today or standing or whatever you're doing, our brains are doing about 11 million bits of activity per second, 11 million. And we have conscious control over fewer than 100 of those bits of activity. So our brains are, of course, pumping the blood through our veins. Our brain is telling us to breathe. It's digesting our breakfast if we had breakfast. We have conscious control over fewer than 100 of those 11 million bits of activity. And I think of my bandwidth as about the width of my head. So this is my attentional resources, some people call them. Some people call them cognitive capacity. So this isn't about how smart you are. This is about how much of your smarts you have to bring to a learning setting. So these authors are saying when you're poor, you're always worried about money. You're worried about what money can buy, of course. So you're worried about your car breaking down or your child getting sick or you getting sick. You're worried about buying food, let alone decent, nutritious food for you and your family. You're worried, if you're a kid, you're worried about having clothes that don't immediately out you as a poor person. You're worried about having a warm winter coat. You're worried about having shoes. You're worried about having food because you're hungry. So all these worries take up bandwidth. And so you may come to school as a third grader or fifth grader or whatever age, and you're coming to school with this much bandwidth because of all these other things. And so it's hard to learn when your bandwidth is depleted. When I read this book, I've been teaching for 25 years, and I thought of all the other kinds of scarcity that our students have. Mostly I've been teaching in higher ed, but some in K-12. And I thought of all the other kinds of scarcity, like scarcity of respect, of safety, of belonging, of visibility for people in some groups. So I thought of all those things that take away bandwidth from our students. And I called these social psychological underminers. And here's a list. I'm going to go over some of these. Some of you will know what some of them are and some of you won't. So those of you who know all this stuff, you can take a short nap while I'm talking about this. Stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is a term coined by Claude Steele, who's a Stanford professor. And it's the phenomenon that when you're in a performance situation, so some situation where you need to do something, so let's say for students, an exam at any level, and you're a member of a group about whom there are negative stereotypes. So you go into that test, and let's say you're a Black child. Well, you know at a very young age that you're not considered to be as smart as the white kids. Well, some of your bandwidth is used up on worrying that you're going to do poorly on this exam. And then people are going to say, see, we were right all along. Those Black kids aren't as smart as white kids. And that's what happens. Students' scores go down. And this, at Stanford, Claude Steele and his colleagues dealt with, first tested students at Stanford, Black and students and white students. But this has been repeated, this kind of experiment has been repeated dozens of times since the mid-1990s on women and girls in math and science, for instance, on older people. If you give older people a test of endurance or speed, even if they were athletes earlier, this stereotype threat is going to depress their performance. So this effect starts with kids in early learning, preschool, and then they start getting those tests in third grade, fifth grade, eighth grade, and then they take the ACT or the SAT. Stereotype threat can depress the scores of students who are Black or brown, or students who have a disability, or LGBTQ students if they don't feel safe and accepted where they are. And of course, then, so fewer of students in these minoritized groups get to college. And once they get to college, then that stereotype threat is hanging over them and make it more likely they'll quit early after an early failure. Belonging. This, when I did research for my book, the aspect of belonging came up probably more than anything. And Walton and Cohen, two researchers, coined this term belonging uncertainty. And they're talking about, and I'm talking about belonging in the sense of somebody comes to school, again, at any grade, you come the first day of school and you're thinking, will I find a friend? Will somebody like me? Will somebody ask me to be in their group? Will somebody ask me to go play basketball after school? Those kinds of things are very important. The friend thing, the acceptance thing, but what I'm also talking about that's more fundamental, especially when students get into high school and college, is social capital. And social capital are the networks we have. And we get social capital basically from the family we grew up in, what our parents did for a living, where we live, lots of those kinds of things. So it's not something that you necessarily earn, you just have it or you don't have it. So Walton and Cohen focused on first generation, non-majority, low-income students, and found that many of them didn't have very much social capital. So social capital in college, for instance, is when you need some of the services. And those of you who hear from higher ed, we offer everything: tutoring, math labs, writing labs, counseling. We offer so much support, but if you don't have any social capital, if you don't know the networks, students can easily just drop to the side and kind of disappear. So for instance, my son got a 46 on his first college algebra exam. Well, he could call me, which he did, but he could have called his siblings, his aunts and uncles. Lots of people in his family had already been to college. So he had lots of people he could call and say, what should I do? Well, lots of people don't have somebody if they're the first person in their family to go to college, for instance, or if they grew up really poor and just don't know the system of higher ed, which is higher education in this country is basically a middle and upper class institution across the country. That's how it started. And I would assert that that's how it is. So students kind of fall by the wayside. And then add on that, if you're a member of a group that is marginalized. So, and you don't feel comfortable in all your identities. And then that's where so not having social capital takes up a bunch of bandwidth, but if you're not comfortable in your own skin and identity at your school, it takes up a lot more bandwidth. So if you're hiding something, so if you're hiding the fact that you're gay or lesbian, you're hiding the fact that you're trans, you may be hiding that your father is in prison, or somebody in your family has an addiction, or maybe you yourself have a cognitive disability or mental illness. If students are hiding anything, if they can't be their whole selves in a classroom, that takes up so much bandwidth. So that's really a key thing to help students regain bandwidth, is to make sure everybody can belong in all their identities. Microaggressions. You have a handout on microaggressions. If we were together, we could talk about examples of microaggressions. I think most of you know this word because it's kind of out there in the general vernacular. But let me give you the sort of formal definition. Microaggressions are assaults, slights, insults, invalidations that happen to people in minoritized groups, marginalized groups. So they could be verbal or nonverbal. They could be intended or unintended to be insults or slights. So it's being followed around in stores if you're a person of color because people think you're going to steal something. It's being belittled. It's being kind of snide remarks made about you. Often microaggressions sound like compliments. And this is part of why microaggressions are so damaging to our bandwidth, because they could be intended or unintended. So somebody says to a person for whom Spanish is their first language, "You speak really good English." Now the unsaid end of that sentence is for a Mexican. Or I've had students tell me, young Black women, somebody will say, "You're really pretty." But what they know, they're thinking for a Black girl. Or you have really good fashion sense for a large woman, or whatever. You hear these things that kind of are compliments, but you're pretty sure they're a kind of a belittling thing. And this takes up lots of bandwidth compared to a more just in your face kind of racism or sexism or whatever the ism is, because you're spending your bandwidth thinking, first, feeling shocked. This is 2021 and somebody still makes a comment like that and nobody steps up and challenges that. So what if you're a student who just walked into the first day of your class in the fall? Or what if you just got a job and somebody makes a comment, a racist comment, a homophobic comment, a classist comment, and you have to think, did they mean that? Or are they just ignorant? And I'm not using ignorant in a mean way, just they don't know any better. They're trying to connect. Or did they mean it? And if they meant it, am I going to be safe here? Do I want to be in this class? Should I find another teacher? Or am I going to be safe in this school if you're in K-12? Are you going to go home to your parent and say, I don't feel like I'm safe here? So that takes up a lot of cognitive capacity wondering about that. And we think somebody challenged me in New York a couple of years ago. If this was a Black man, I think he was an HR guy, if I recall. And he said, are you telling me that people make these comments and they don't mean it? And I said, yes. And this was in New York. Growing up in the Midwest, in Kansas, people are nice here. I don't know if people are nice in Kentucky. They say stupid things. I should say we. They're just trying to connect. They don't know. I grew up in a town of 1,500 people with almost virtually all white people. We don't know. So we try to connect and we say insensitive things. So yes, I think a lot of people make these comments and they don't mean to be mean. But it takes a lot of energy in your band, takes a lot of bandwidth to sort that out. So microaggressions are extremely damaging to all of our ability to think. I want to mention vicarious racism and trauma. I was already talking about this before the pandemic and before all the social unrest last summer, and it's continuing. Vicarious racism or vicarious trauma, or it could be vicarious homophobia, it could be vicarious classism. This is just what it sounds like, that you don't have to be yourself the target of a rude comment or violence. But if you share, especially if you share an identity with people who are the targets of that violence or those insults, you are feeling those same stress hormones. So if I were with you in a room, I was up on a stage and you're all sitting there in the audience and I drop something really heavy on my foot or I fall off the stage, which is something I probably could do these days. I would be in pain and you would see me in pain, but every one of you, because we're empathetic human beings, every one of you would be, you know how you cringe if you see somebody get hurt, and the stress hormones are shooting off in your bodies as well. So everything that happened last summer, especially if you're a Black person, I know my colleagues in Chicago, they were just tapped out because every day, all this stuff on the news, I was feeling it too, but as a white person, I don't feel like I was feeling it as deeply. So they were stressed out all the time because of all the things that were going on. And they wanted to be out there, especially during the pandemic, because they wanted to be out there in solidarity as well, but they didn't feel like it was safe because of COVID. Their kids were coming home from college and their kids wanted to be out there, but their parents are worried because they're going to get COVID or get shot, I mean, worse. So you get the vicarious thing. And it can look like post-traumatic stress disorder. So the symptoms of anxiety, depression, inability to concentrate, which is the bandwidth thing. So people who are experiencing this, and I would say that Black and brown people in this country and poor people and indigenous people have felt this for centuries, unfortunately. So it's not a new thing, but it is, I think, kind of a new conversation in psychology over the last, I don't know how many years. Okay, adverse childhood experiences, I want to mention, these are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, obviously adverse being negative. You have a handout on this that gives you the 10 basic ones. This is out of a public health study that was done in the end of the 1990s in San Diego. And they asked about 17,000 people who got their health care from a certain central place in San Diego, what had happened to them when they were children. And you see from this list, it's about abuse and neglect. It's about incarceration of adults in the family, mental health issues, addictions, domestic violence. And you can see from, if you're looking at the thing, it just says, before you were 18, did this thing happen to you? And there's a list of 10 things. And then you have an ACE score. So if nothing bad happened to you, your score is 0. And a whole bunch of things, you might have a 6 or 7 ACE score. And then they correlated those scores with health and well-being outcomes for the adults, about 46 things they looked at. Physical things like heart disease, hypertension, obesity, cancer, all those kinds of things. And then lots of well-being things like mental health and mental illness, like unemployment, like divorce and separation, those kind of things. And not unsurprisingly, they found there was a correlation. If you had a high ACE score, if lots of bad things happened to you when you were a kid, you were more likely to have these chronic illnesses and other things happening to you in your life. And the reason I talk about this are mainly two. One is that the researchers on ACEs say that ACEs are not destiny, that they have found that the presence of one caring adult in the life of a child can seriously mitigate, in a positive way, these negative outcomes as an adult. So those of us in education, we are often that person, right? You all, I bet everyone in the room could tell a story of reaching out to a student and how that made a huge difference in the life of students. And of course, ideally it's when they're a child, but I don't think it's ever too late to be that one person. And those of us who have worked in college, and especially community colleges, we work with very young students. So when I teach classes, if somebody isn't in my class, I taught a class on Monday night in Oklahoma for 6 years. So they don't show up Monday night, they haven't sent me an email. I send them an email or a text. Hey, we missed you in class. I hope you're okay. And students, and I'm sure you can tell these same stories. I've had students over the 25 years I've been teaching tell me the next week or the next year or 5 years from then, that message from you saved my life. Now, it's usually not that serious, but I've had students in college say, I was going to quit. I was done. And I got a message from you, and I knew there was another human being in the world who even knew I existed. So, and that text or email took me 0 bandwidth and 30 seconds, and it can make a huge difference in the life of a person. And those of you who are in pre-K to 12, I mean, I know you have these opportunities every day to be that person for that kid who says, hey, I see you. I know you exist. I know you have potential. Let's see, what's happening. Then the second reason I bring it up is that the researchers have said that it has fundamentally changed the question they ask when they talk to people from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And what a huge difference in a question. Or with children, what's happening to you? What's happening in your life? I have found that what's wrong with you is usually a blaming and shaming question. So why can't you get to school on time? Why don't you find a way to take care of your kids so you can get to class? Why aren't you motivated? They're all blaming and shaming questions, which in general, in my experience, aren't very effective. It's unpleasant. And it also doesn't work very well to get students to do better. What's happening is followed by, and how can I help? And again, I'm talking my experience mostly in college. So it's what's happening. And when I ask that question, I can tell you pretty much 100% of the time, it's a bandwidth issue. My students aren't sitting at home saying, I don't want to do my work. Something has happened. Their child is sick. Their father's had a heart attack. They just got diagnosed with a chronic illness. Something has happened to knock them off the trail. And then we talk about it. And we say, well, how can we work with this? Can you get the assignment in later, etc.? So you have a conversation. And with younger kids, they may be hungry. You feed them. Lots of things, it's not, many times it's not complicated, at least in the today. And then you work with them on all the other tomorrows. So recognizing that students have these ACEs. And the thing about ACEs is so interesting. And if we were together, I would try to get a sense of the incidence of ACEs among us. Because the thing about ACEs is we don't talk about them as a general rule. So you could be working with somebody for 20 years and you wouldn't know that they were abused as a child or grew up really, really poor. And yet we want our students, again, now I'm talking about college, to tell us. And I'll have teachers say to me, well, if she'd only told me, I could have helped her. But now it's too late. She's failed the class. Well, why would somebody tell you? And especially if you're a Black or a brown person in this country, and we know from lots of data that Black and brown people are not treated fairly and equally in the healthcare system, and certainly not in the mental healthcare system. So why would they tell me when I'm the teacher? Why would somebody say I have a mental illness or my mom has a mental illness? They don't trust me, nor should they particularly. So it's our responsibility as educational institutions to create environments where people feel safe to tell. And then we can help. And one of the things I do as a teacher is I don't have time to get into all this, but I try to share a few of my bumps in the road so they can look at me and say, oh, maybe she will understand if I tell her about this. But that's difficult to do. Okay, last bad thing. I want to talk about uncertainty. And uncertainty, I think, undergirds all of these underminers I've been talking about. Because when you talk about stereotype threat, microaggressions, all of this stuff is about, there's always in your mind, students at all ages, will I be safe? Will I be loved? Will I find a friend? Will I be treated fairly? Those questions are always taken up part of the bandwidth. So that's just that's pre-pandemic, that's pre the social unrest of last summer. That's just the normal thing. If you're Black or brown, if you have a disability, if you're LGBTQ in many places, if you grew up really poor, if you have money problems. So now, this last year, with the pandemic, uncertainty, of course, exploded. But uncertainty is not evenly distributed among us, right? I remember I was in Chicago, March 16th last year. We were told at Malcolm X College, pack up your stuff because we're going to be working from home. Well, my certainty and my bandwidth exploded because I was on a train 40 minutes a day going to downtown Chicago to work with thousands of people. And there was a pandemic and I was breathing that common air. So I was a bit nervous. I was doing it. But when they told me stay at home, oh my gosh, I was so relieved because I lived in a tiny little condo in a neighborhood where I could walk for a safe neighborhood, no kids running around. I wasn't taking care of anybody but me. So I could do my job perfectly well from home. Kept my job, kept my salary. I was good. But so many of my colleagues, and some of you know at community colleges, faculty are teaching 5 courses or more. And now they're home and they have kids who they're also trying to help with school. And lots of our students lost their jobs, or they didn't lose their jobs. They're working in grocery stores and in medical facilities and places they have to go to work and be in danger of catching the virus. So the uncertainty among just the people I know in my life was from, my certainty went up and other people's just crashed. They were at home with lots of people in their homes, not enough bandwidth in a technological way. So, and we know, and then as the pandemic rolled out, more Black and brown people were getting sick and dying. That's in itself a psychological bandwidth stealer, right? That we live in a country where really we've said it's okay that certain people aren't as healthy and aren't doing as well. Then George Floyd gets murdered on, what was it, May 25th? And then things go crazy. Uncertainty, again, not evenly distributed. There was lots of unrest in Chicago, for instance, for personally me, but I lived clear on the up by O'Hare. So it didn't touch me. It touched a lot of people personally and in their neighborhoods. So that was not even. And then just the constant bandwidth cost of that whole issue of violence against Black and brown people by the state, crushing to some people's bandwidth, not evenly. And then the whole political thing last year, which I think lasted 10 years, right? It seemed like the whole campaign and just the nastiness and everything that went on leading into this year, and the disruption and the things that happened at the Capitol. So we're just full of uncertainty, and uncertainty gobbles up bandwidth. And yeah, anyway, we could go on about that, but I won't. Okay, I wanted to have some happy things. What can we do about this? So now I've talked about all the ways that all these things take up bandwidth, and I want to give just a few. Wish I had lots more time to work with you, and I'd love to come back and work with some of you on looking at these bandwidth strategies or bandwidth recovery strategies. I'm trying to pay attention to the time, but there's my phone. Okay. I want to assert that this bandwidth perspective is a strengths perspective as opposed to a deficit perspective. And I put this crow up here. I love crows. Crows are the second smartest birds in the world, by the way, after the talking parrots and those birds. But this bird, even though it's the second strongest bird in the world, could not be strong and smart. And anyway, I bet the second smartest bird if it didn't have food or drink, or kids were throwing rocks at it every day, it would lose some of its bandwidth. Anyway, I say it's a strengths perspective because what this bandwidth perspective says is ourselves and our students are smart enough. It's not a matter of being smart enough. Every kid, every 2-year-old, 3-year-old is smart enough if they had all their cognitive capacity to bring into the learning environment. But when you're losing to poverty, to racism, to homophobia, all these things, and you're coming into your classroom or your preschool with this much bandwidth, we can be brilliant teachers, we can have beautiful schools, we can dump lots of money into the educational endeavor, and students aren't going to learn because they have this much bandwidth. So I do talk with students. I love to talk with students, and they get it so fast because they're living this stuff. But I think it's our responsibility as the grown-ups in education to create learning environments where students can recover their bandwidth. And that's what my work has been about. Missy, remind me what time you want me to stop.
This session will end at 10:15, and we'd love to add some questions at the end. So as much time as you want to allow for that.
I think we're good. Okay, thank you for that reminder. Okay, I want to talk about funds of knowledge because it undergirds the rest of the things I'm going to talk about. Funds of knowledge is a term that comes out of early childhood learning. Gonzalez and Moll and some of their colleagues talk about if you look at a child who grows up in a poor home, so a home that doesn't have 1,000 books in it, doesn't have all the latest technology and toys, and doesn't live in a beautiful neighborhood, you can look at that little 2-year-old or 3-year-old and think they're empty. They don't know anything. But they're saying, oh my gosh, every child, 2-year-old, 3-year-old knows so many things and can do so many things. They learn from basically their family, their household. They learn from what their parents do for a living. They learn about gardening and cooking and cultural practices and learn from people in their neighborhood. They come with so much. So they're saying, let's start with that. And when I read about funds of knowledge, again, most of my background is in higher ed. And I thought in this country, if you are low income, non-majority, first generation student, and you make it to college, you're coming with a bunch of stuff. And you could look at any grade and say that. So students who come to college in those categories, they've probably worked since they were maybe 14 years old, contributing to their family income or taking care of their own needs. They've maybe been on a sports team or sung in a choir or volunteered in the neighborhood. They've survived They know a lot of stuff and can do a lot of stuff. Now, can they read and write and do math at a college level? Well, maybe not, because of the way we fund public education in this country. If you grow up in a poor neighborhood, you go to a poor school. Not a good idea, but that's what we've decided to do. And because if you don't have much money and you're a Black or brown person, and et cetera, you've had depleted bandwidth probably since you were in preschool. So there are reasons why you don't have some of the academic skills, but you're bringing a lot. And lots of times, in my experience in community colleges, we invite students to come to college and then we give them these placement exams. And one of the first messages we say to students is, you don't read well enough, you don't write well enough, you don't do math well enough. So the first messages are, you're not good enough. And I know and these are students who've already gotten those messages in grade school and high school, right? Because of the culture we live in. They don't need those messages. What if we started with, what do you know and what can you do? What have you learned about working with people, especially people who don't look and act like you? They're bringing lots of stuff to the table. And I'm saying, let's start with those things and leverage those and build on those to have them learn then in college and succeed. Related, and you have handouts on, I know there's a handout on this, connecting the known to the unknown. I want to give you a little more brain science. So whenever we see, hear, feel, taste, experience anything, the first thing our brain does is question, do I already know that? Well, we, and all of us are grown-ups in this room, I assume. We've been around, we know most things, right? So when I walk out on my Malcolm X in Chicago to get the train to go home, my brain I don't have to think, what is that? I know that's a train. I know those are cars. I know that's a street. I know almost everything because I've been around a while. Well, it's true of our students too. So when I teach my sociology class, I know that my students are listening to me and they're thinking, you know what, I don't know exactly what you're saying, but it sounds like something I saw in a documentary, or I learned in high school, or I learned in another class, or something my dad told me about that he knows from work. So brain scientists tell us that the sweet spot for learning is if you can hook that new thing to something the student already knows. So I think of my brain as having all these little hooks of things I already know. And the best way for me to learn a new thing is if I can say, oh, this new thing is something like something I already know. And then I hook that in, I practice that, I form those new neural pathways, and then it becomes a new hook for the next thing. But this is predicated, with students, this is predicated on the fact that they already have these funds of knowledge. Back when I went to college, eons ago, I feel like it was more, the professor thought that we were just empty vessels. And he was just going to dump stuff in. It was usually a he. He was going to dump stuff in and fill us up with this information. Well, that's a long time ago. Now we are recognizing students know a lot, and we can light up their mind with hooking the new thing in there because we know they know a lot. And research will show the learning is better if you can hook on something they know. And the handout talks about that. Please contact me if you want to know more about the handouts, because it tells you some things I've done in class, but it's probably a little hard to understand if I don't explain it further. Growth mindset, you have a handout about this. I'm sure you've all heard the term growth mindset. Let me just say a few things about it. You have a handout that says the difference between growth and fixed mindset. This is Carol Dweck's work, another Stanford person. She worked with kids, I think, in the 90s as well. I think she worked with fifth graders, but I always forget that. But her point is what she started noticing in these kids were two pretty distinct mindsets. A mindset that was fixed, that says we're just as smart as, we're born a certain smartness and that's just how it's going to stay. Or maybe I'm born good at music or not, or I'm born a natural athlete or not. And growth mindset says, and this is biologically true, we can grow our brains, we can get smarter. So you learn new things, you practice, you form new neural pathways, and you grow your brain. So, and Malcolm Gladwell says we can learn anything, any of us could learn anything to proficiency if we practiced for 10,000 hours. which I believe at this point in my life, I'm probably not going to practice anything for 10,000 hours, but I could. So growth mindset, if you have a growth mindset, you're saying, give me feedback. Tell me what I'm doing right and wrong. Give me lots of feedback because I know that I can do over and practice and get better at this thing, whether it's music, sports, academics, math. Fixed mindset about something says, why should I study? Why should I practice? I'm just not good at math. I can't write. Or I can't do sports. And so people who have fixed mindsets, when I teach, when I grade papers, I write all over them. And a student who has a fixed mindset, she's hurt. You just criticized me. I can't write. So now you're attacking me as a person by writing all over my paper. A growth mindset person says, thanks for all that feedback. And they look at it and they take it in and they learn. And at least they don't they make different mistakes, at least next time. I just was listening to a podcast last night about somebody a student who went to college who didn't go to a very good high school. So she was a bit unprepared, but really, had fine intellect. And she was in a class in math where the teacher, so she got not very good grades in her calculus class, but then the teacher, if you get a good grade on the final, that wipes out all that other, and you get an A. She got an A in the class because she did well in the final. That's a growth mindset grading kind of thing. Growth mindset grading is you get do-overs, you get revisions, because it shouldn't matter when you learn it, it is that you learned it. So if you blow your first exam, okay, that's an opportunity to learn, which is why I bring up growth mindset. We can only grow our mind when we run into a barrier. And some of us, so you've had years at work where maybe you have kids at home. When my little kids were at home, I went to work, I did my job well, but I wasn't growing my brain because I didn't have the bandwidth to grow my brain. I was taking care of my kids and I was head of my job. That's why I didn't write my first book till I was 61 years old, because I finally freed up enough bandwidth. My kids were off. So you can only grow your brain when you make mistakes is the golden opportunity to grow your brain. But many students see failure as I blew it. It's over. And students in college, especially community college, I think just disappear. But all through our education, kids and grown-ups need do-overs, this is the opportunity to grow my brain, which is why I emphasize the growth mindset idea. So I think this may be the last idea. I have this thing called high hope syllabus, which I think is a handout, but you can say high hope anyway, anything, any contact you have with students or people. A high hope attitude is high and clear expectations and lots of support. So I think most students at every level, they don't want easy classes. Now, some of you who are in college or have recently been in college, I remember having 5 classes and being really glad that one of them was a little easier because that was nice. But students don't want easy classes. They want to learn. They know that they need to learn. And the message is, I have very high expectations of you. Whether this is preschool, clear through graduate school, my expectations are high and I know you can do it. And I am right here with you. So that's the high hope. And one of the parts of high hope, and you'll see on that handout, is breaking big projects into pieces. And we know this, there's lots of research about how kids and grown-ups are more likely to reach a goal if it's broken into steps. And so a big paper is due at the end of the semester, but it's broken up into a proposal and then an outline and a first draft, and you're getting feedback at every step. And better yet, you're having peer feedback in a class, which is great. So students get exposed to other students' work. And the beauty of this, and I think it's true of all these things I'm talking about, that I have seen in the literature about how to support students and open up their bandwidth, is these are strategies and interventions that give lift. That's a word out of equity talk. They give lift. They help students who most need help. And they don't do any harm to people who come into the class ready to do that. So let's say I went to a really good high school. I already know how to write a research paper. So I'm a first-year student in college, and I go into a class and I have to do the proposal and the outline of the first draft. It doesn't do me any harm. And if the teacher keys in, she can really say to me, you can do better than this. This will get you an A, but you can do better. But the student who never wrote a research paper in high school or didn't get very well instructed, they need those steps. And that'll really help them to do better and does no harm to me who came in knowing how to do it. So that's a really nice thing about these strategies. Another thing in the High Hope syllabus is, and more important during the pandemic, is a little bit of grace. So I give grace periods on all my assignments. So students could get it in 2 days late with no explanation. They just have to tell me it's going to be 2 days late. But then if they don't get it in, we have a conversation. The requirement is you have to come and talk to me. And again, like I said a little while ago, it's always a bandwidth issue. Something has happened that they couldn't get that assignment in. And then we work out a plan. Okay, can you get it in 2 weeks? Well, no, because I'm flying home tonight because I have to help my mom because my dad's in the hospital, whatever. And then you work it out. And what I want to say that reminds me, sometimes when I talk about this grace period, I can tell some faculty are saying, oh, well, everything's just going to be required 2 days later than it really is, and students will take advantage and all this. And I want to say all these interventions and all this kind of attitude really should only be done if you can do it with a joyful spirit. So I know you've all gone to conferences or your boss tells you, you've got to do this thing. And you're thinking, yeah, I don't believe this thing is any good. Well, students get that. They feel that. So forcing people to do these bandwidth enhancing things sometimes doesn't work so well if people don't accept it. But the last thing I'll say is the little bit of hope I have is that if we can remember in this pandemic, those of us who, like me, are economically secure, highly educated, straight white person, who usually in this culture has most of my bandwidth because I don't have to put up with all those things I talked about. But during the pandemic, I feel like most days I have about half my bandwidth, just from worried about, 1,000 things. And the pandemic is no more my fault than racism, poverty, classism, homophobia is the fault of people who have their bandwidth depleted by that. If I can remember that after the pandemic, I think I can more understand, oh, this is what it feels like to not have all my cognitive capacity to put to a task. I think I'll be more willing to understand what it's like for people for whom this is what their life is every day because of the culture we live in. Okay, I think that might be my last. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing so we can have some questions and conversation.
Okay, so our first question is, how do you see the test optional admissions policies as positively impacting students? Although I hear concerns, I think this is going to be a wonderful opportunity for non-traditional and first-generation students.
You must have known the podcast I listened to last night. I listened to this whole thing about the test optional. I am thrilled about it. I think it, and this gave story after story of students who had gotten into college who wouldn't otherwise. And it just brought, well, I mean, I'm not a standardized test fan anyway, because I just think there are several things wrong with it. So I'm very glad. I think that students will have a chance. And what we've seen is students who are admitted to school, even though maybe they went to not the greatest high school because of a variety of reasons, if they're supported, if we recognize that their bandwidth is low, we do things to help them recover their bandwidth, they do well because they're smart enough. But these standardized tests, well, I won't go into the whole long thing. I'm very excited about the no testing.
And the next question is, will you speak on the bandwidth of professors working at research institutions who are required to do research and teaching, their impact on their students?
Yes, and this is kind of the frontier of my work, and people are asking this all the time. And so not only the research one, all of us, this caring about students' bandwidth takes up bandwidth from preschool learning all the way through graduate school. If you are a person who cares about students' bandwidth, it's going to take up your bandwidth. So let me say something about that. One thing is, and I hope Dr. Thompson will agree with this, one of the changes we could make is imagine a world where all of us were doing this work. Because what my observation has been in, at least in higher ed, the people doing the work, when I say the work, I mean caring about students, nurturing them, helping them, listening to them. It's women, and it's especially women of color, but people of color in general. And people who share identities with some of the students who are struggling. So some of us do a disproportionately large part of the work. And I remember I was in Kansas City and a professor asked me that very question. You know, I'm on a tenure track, I have these research responsibilities, and she understood the bandwidth thing, and her students knew that. So of course she has lines of students waiting to talk with her because they know she gets it and they'll listen. She still has to do her research. And so a couple of things. What if we all did it? So people in every class and every office were doing this. So some of us didn't have to do the huge part of it. We'd just distribute the work a little bit more. And then the second thing I'll say is it needs to count. This work needs to count. And again, in higher ed is where I have my most familiarity, but we often give awards to people who do lots of work with students who need lots of help. We're so glad you're here. You've helped students so much. We're going to give you this outstanding human being award. Well, no, give people a raise. Have it count toward tenure and promotion on a career path, because it often doesn't count in any way except, oh, we're really grateful. If students really love you, yeah, they really love me, and it takes lots of bandwidth. So I think institutionally, you leaders here in the room, we need to start looking at who is doing the work. This is emotional labor. This is critical to retention and graduation of students at every level to student learning. So yes, I'm not minimizing the fact that it takes up lots of bandwidth. But one of the things, just quickly, if you're on the tenure track, et cetera, making your syllabus a high hope syllabus with extreme clarity for students, taking all the uncertainty out, I think will help, because then students are at least not asking you lots of questions because you've made everything extremely clear so that you decrease students' uncertainty, and that will help, I think, free up some of your time as well.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions. What programs could be used before starting the first college semester that would best serve students as a way to grow their perceived comfort, safety, and acceptance in the school's environment?
That's a good question. Well, there are lots of models of summer programs. Students come early. Maybe they spend August on campus. I think so much, and I'm not convinced it would have to be on campus, but one of the things, back to the testing thing, if students don't have to take the ACT or the SAT, sometimes students in high school who do well in high school and rank high in their class, and then they take that test and they're just demoralized, and it just cuts off their confidence. So I think not taking those tests will help in the first place. But the other thing is, what can we do to increase their sense of belonging? That they are a real part of this institution. And I just read something about students taking online courses at colleges before they come, which has happened during the pandemic. So what if your school offered a junior or senior in high school can take courses online And the story was about how brilliant these students were doing who came from really kind of disadvantaged educational environments. Well, that boosted their confidence right there. They found out, oh, I can do this work. And you can do that from a distance. I think first year experiences, I don't know if you know what's happening at Georgia State. I got to visit Georgia State quite a while ago, and they are in Atlanta, and they are known for having closed the graduation gaps across race, ethnicity, and income. And they have required learning communities. So the students, when you come in as a first year student, you're in a group of 25 students and you take classes. So your 25 might be in a psychology class with 200 other students, but you're in your 25. And then you have a first year seminar. I think those are powerful because then you have a support group. So building support groups. And what I do in my classes, and I think I would do across any classes, is maximize diversity in those groups. So we think about, well, I think two things are true. One is it's important to have the Multicultural Student Center and the LGBTQ Center and the Veteran Center and those places where people can go. They're called counter spaces. You can go and let your hair down and relax. Those are important in-group things. But when you're talking about, like in my classes, I form study groups for the semester, maximizing diversity. Because for one thing, I think it's the responsibility of all of us educators at any level to help people appreciate difference, because we live in a multicultural society. But it also maximizes learning. So my students are in a group of 4 or 5 students all semester, and they take quizzes together. If I have a group in which everybody looks like me and has the same background and thinks like me, I might as well only have me, because we all think the same. So if you get groups based on maximum difference, race, ethnicity, gender, background, learning style, you have a powerful group, because then when you solve a problem, you have all these different ways to think about it. So I think, so first year or even pre-first year, solidarity in sameness on the one hand, and maximizing exposure to people different than yourself, and figuring out that both those things have their strength. So, but the thing of belonging and normalizing that difference. I talked to a person at Wake Tech in North Carolina, and she runs a program for adults, one of the trade programs. And many of the adults, this is just an example, come in and I think they're thinking, I'm the only one with a job and kids and all these other things. And she talks to them, oh no, you're kind of the norm. Most people in this program have these bandwidth depleting things. So that's another thing of belonging, is and back to the adverse childhood experiences. I think many of us go through life thinking everybody else's family was okay. Mine's the only one that's really messed up. And when you find out, which is sad, that lots of people have these things, but at least you know I'm not alone. Lots of people have had these challenges like me. And also understanding this bandwidth concept. Students, when I talk to students about it, I think this heavy weight falls off, because they understand, oh, this isn't about me being a loser because I can't seem to focus on school. People who look like me, are like me, have this disability like me, whatever, we're all experiencing this because of this culture we live in. And it just takes that blame and shame away, which is blame and shame are huge bandwidth stealers. So you can kind of get rid of that. So those are some of the things I would emphasize in helping students get going.
Many universities who are going test optional still require course placement tests before students arrive on campus to place them in the math, science, and English courses. Do you consider those just an ACT with another name, or are there ways to turn those into positives without telling students you're not good at math off the bat?
That is such a good question. And I have, of course, mixed feelings about those placement tests. And as any administrator on this meeting knows, you look at data and some people are misplaced. They could have been in the college level class, and some should have been in a developmental class. So they're certainly not trouble-free. But here's, let me say, so I don't really have a clear answer, but let me say something about the testing environment that I think would help so much. Remember I talked about stereotype threat. There is good research that says we can turn that on or turn it off. So here's an example. If you have students coming in to your college or any other level and you want them to do a writing sample, and before they do the writing sample, you give them a piece of paper and they have to mark their race, ethnicity, their income, and you ask them, is English your first language? You have just turned on stereotype threat like that. You're reminding them, okay, I'm in a group about whom there are negative stereotypes. I grew up speaking Spanish or French or whatever it is. Or, and I've been thinking this through, what if you gave them a piece of paper and said, briefly describe a time you set a goal for yourself that you reached, or write a couple sentences about the best piece of wisdom you got from somebody in your family, or write about the thing you're best at. Write a paragraph about the thing you're best. So you're turning on their confidence. You're saying, you are good enough. You can do this. And what if you came into a testing center and on the walls were pictures of respected people who shared some identity with people? So if you're a school where most of the students are Black or brown, what if you have pictures of people the students will recognize and respect that have the same color skin they do? I think we can do, and what if you fed them? What if you fed every student? And what if we got rid of time? This is another thing about higher ed and ed in general. It's a Western linear time system. Why is 3 hours to do a test important? What, I can't see one reason except convenience. That if it takes me, I have one son who reads very slowly, he probably wouldn't even get halfway through a test. Why is it important to do it in 3 hours? It puts so much pressure, and it's such a Western way of looking at things. Why can't you take the afternoon? Why can't we have some food there so that you're not hungry? Hungry people cannot learn. Hungry people cannot perform. So I think there's so many things we could do in the testing environment so that those results would be more representative of the students' real abilities. And then the other thing is, I know schools where if you start out in developmental English, so your test was not very good, and you start out in the under college level English, if the teacher sees within the first couple of essays, she can bump you up to the college level. I think that is another really good way to do it. So you make a correction. You realize, oh, or it could be the other way. And then there's lots of co-curricular things. So you take the college level course with the developmental course right after, where you get some support, and then you end up passing both of those. When in the old days, you would have had to take one semester with the developmental and then another semester with the English, the college level.
Those are all our questions, Dr. Verschelden. I want to thank you for your time today and giving us something to think about, looking at it in different ways, and the ways that at the end goal is to always serve our students. As we close, we are going to take a break to just get prepared for Dr. Thompson's address. We'll have a short video, and we would like for you all to stay tuned.
Okay, thank you so much.